At first, it seemed harmless, almost trivial. Light, rhythmic taps that echoed faintly from the dark hallway outside his bedroom door. The kind of sound you could easily ignore, like a neighbor walking down the hall, or the old pipes of the building groaning with age. The protagonist, a rational skeptic, dismissed it as nothing more than the house settling or the wind, which always seemed to find its way through the cracks in the old building. He was alone in his small, shabby apartment, the kind that could have used a fresh coat of paint and a little more attention, but he was used to it. The place had its quirks, sure, but nothing to be afraid of, nothing to worry about. At least, that's what he told himself. But then, something changed. The knocking, which had been so easily ignored at first, began to evolve. It wasn't just random taps anymore. It grew louder, more deliberate. Each night, it seemed to come closer to his door, as though whatever was behind it was inching toward him, drawn by some unseen force. What had once felt like an innocent noise now felt like something wrong. The knocks started to sound more urgent, as if the thing or perhaps the person outside was trying to get in. The sound resonated deeper into his bones, vibrating through the thin walls of the apartment. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the house settling. The rhythm was too precise, too unnatural. His sleep grew restless. What had once been a soft tap had become a steady pounding that kept him awake, eyes wide open in the dark, heart racing. The knocking echoed in his mind long after the sound stopped, following him into his dreams. But still, he told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. There was no logical explanation for it, and he wasn't about to give in to fear. After all, he had always been the type of person who laughed off superstitions. He had lived a life of science and reason, and he wasn't going to let some noises ruin that. But then it escalated. One evening, the knocking started earlier than usual. It was around 9 p.m., just as he settled in for the night, trying to unwind with a movie. The tap-tap-tap came again, light at first, barely noticeable over the hum of his television. But it grew louder, as though the sound was coming from just outside the door, vibrating through the very wood. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just the wind, or maybe even the building's aging plumbing. He turned up the volume on the TV, but the tapping didn't stop. Instead, it quickened, the rhythm becoming more insistent, like a heartbeat pounding against the door. It was too much. He couldn't concentrate on the movie anymore, and a creeping sense of unease settled over him like a thick fog. His anxiety began to rise as the noise persisted, no longer just an inconvenience, but something that tugged at the edges of his sanity. He stood up, pacing around the apartment, trying to shake off the feeling. He made his way to the door, staring at the knob. There it was again, the rhythmic tapping. It almost sounded like someone was knocking in a pattern, as if it were a code. But what was the message? He'd never been good at deciphering things that didn't make sense. He grabbed his coat and pulled it on, thinking maybe a walk would help clear his head. He needed to get out of this apartment. But before he could move toward the door, a sudden gust of cold wind rushed through the room, like an invisible hand reaching in and stealing the warmth. It sent a shiver down his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned sharply, but the windows were closed, the curtains drawn. How could that be possible? The knocking came again, louder than ever. It was no longer just at the door. It sounded as if it were coming from all around him. A sense of foreboding filled the air. He tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Something he couldn't explain. Something he couldn't control. The cold wind swirled again, and he found himself walking toward the door, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The knocking wouldn't stop. It was an obsessive, rhythmic thumping that seemed to demand attention. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle. It was ice cold, the chill seeping into his skin. The moment his fingers touched it, the knocking stopped. For a second, he froze, the silence ringing louder than the sound of the knocks ever had. His breath hitched in his throat, and he could feel the sweat pooling at the base of his neck, the cold sweat of fear. Then, with a sharp twist, he opened the door. The moment the door creaked open, his eyes scanned the hallway. Empty. Not a single person in sight. Just the dimly lit corridor, stretching far down into the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. Could it have been a prank? Someone playing a sick joke on him? He leaned out, scanning the darkness with wide eyes, trying to find any trace of movement. But nothing. The air felt stagnant, still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. His gaze shifted to the farthest corner of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to stretch and pull, flickering like they were alive. He stepped into the hallway, eyes never leaving the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. Then, without warning, it happened. A cold, icy gust of wind rushed past him from behind, so sharp that it left him gasping for breath. He barely had time to react before the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The sound of the impact echoed in his ears, and he stumbled backward, his heart racing, panic rising in his throat. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a bone-chilling cold that swept through the air like a wave, leaving goosebumps across his skin. He could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him. Something had changed. Something was wrong. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He turned around slowly, as if in a trance. The room felt different now. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more alive. The flickering overhead light buzzed, threatening to go out completely. The silence was no longer comforting, it was stifling. And then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the sound of a distant conversation, the whispers crept through the air. Low, guttural sounds that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The voice was indecipherable, like a language that wasn't meant for human ears, ancient and cruel. It came from every corner, vibrating through his bones. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the meaning, and it was a message he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The whispers grew louder, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing against him like a heavy weight. Jinn. The word echoed in his mind, though he had never truly believed in such things. No, he wouldn't believe in that. It was just superstition, folklore. Yet, there it was, unmistakable. A presence, something beyond his understanding. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation. A prank? A figment of his imagination? But nothing fit. He could feel it now, the weight of something watching him. Something old. Something powerful. The temperature dropped again, colder now. His breath fogged in front of him. He had never felt cold like this before, not in his entire life. It was as if the very air had turned against him. It wasn't just in the room. It was inside him, tightening around his chest like a vice. He stepped backward, feeling the oppressive presence closing in on him. The room had transformed. The walls seemed to be shifting, closing in on him, the space narrowing. He wasn't alone anymore. Was it too late? He asked himself, his thoughts spinning. Had he let it in by opening the door? Had he invited whatever this was into his life? It was here now. It had found him. Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence. A laugh. A sharp, mocking giggle that came from somewhere behind him. It wasn't human. It was distorted, guttural. as though it didn't belong in this world. His blood ran cold. That laugh, it was like a dagger through his soul. Frozen in place, he turned to face the corner of the room, eyes wide. There, in the shadows, he saw them, the shifting, twisting shapes. They were no longer just shadows. They were alive. And they were watching him. The laughter echoed louder, reverberating through his skull. The jinn's power pressing down on him, suffocating him. The room was no longer a room. It was a prison. He was trapped. His thoughts were no longer his own. The whispers grew louder, muddling his mind. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The presence was inside him now, feeding off his fear, overwhelming him. The walls seemed to close in tighter. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would explode. The laughter, the whispers, the cold, it was all consuming. And he realized, too late, there was no escape. He had to do something, anything. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for his phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it, but he couldn't stop. He needed a solution, a way out of the suffocating nightmare that had taken over his apartment. He searched frantically, his eyes darting from one article to the next, but the glow of the screen did nothing to ease his panic. Rituals, prayers, spells, anything that could cleanse the air, any method that would rid him of the presence that was slowly, relentlessly, driving him to madness. But nothing felt real. Nothing offered any comfort. Nothing had the strength to pierce the thick, heavy air in the apartment. His culture, his beliefs had always warned him against messing with things he didn't understand. Jinn, they were no ordinary spirits. They were powerful, ancient forces that could possess, torment, and if you weren't careful, kill. They didn't play by the rules, and they certainly didn't care about what you believed or what you tried. He wasn't just dealing with a haunted apartment or a passing supernatural disturbance. No, this was different. This thing wasn't going to go away. It was here to stay. His mind raced, but it felt as if the thoughts were moving too quickly for him to catch. He clicked on another link, but his focus was slipping. The room around him had grown impossibly quiet, except for the faintest of whispers in the air. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the malice in them. His heart seemed to beat harder in his chest. The whispers were growing louder. But it wasn't just the whispers that unnerved him. No, it was the feeling in the pit of his stomach, the sensation that something was closing in on him, that something unseen and unexplainable was slowly encroaching on every inch of his space, of his very existence. He pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to focus. Focus on finding a way to rid himself of this thing. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept spiraling back to the same horrifying realization. There was nothing. No ritual. No prayer. No spell. Everything he had read, everything he had tried, had fallen short. And still, the whispers continued, pressing on his mind, clawing at his thoughts like 1,000 unseen fingers. The air around him felt thick. He felt it pressing against his skin, the weight of it unbearable. The walls of the apartment, once familiar and safe, now seemed to close in on him. They felt suffocating, like they were in on the game, working with the jinn to trap him. His skin tingled, his breath shallow, as if the apartment itself was alive, watching him, waiting. His pulse quickened, and he could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. It was too quiet, far too quiet. He had always believed that silence was peaceful, that it meant safety, but not now. Not in this room. This silence was oppressive. It was the calm before the storm. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was building up to something terrible. And then suddenly, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking. At first, he thought it might be someone at the door. His mind clung to the hope of it being anything normal. A neighbor, perhaps, or someone with good news. He rushed to the door, half expecting to see someone on the other side. But when he opened it, the hallway was empty. There was no one. No one but the heavy, stifling air and the ever-present whispering. He closed the door quickly, the feeling of dread settling deeper in his stomach. But then, the knocking came again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. The knocking was coming from within the walls, from the very space around him, as if the apartment itself was alive, knocking in rhythm with the maddening whispers. He spun around, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The room had grown darker. Despite the fact that the sun hadn't fully set, the shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, growing thicker, more substantial. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, reaching out to him, calling to him. His mind tried to latch onto anything that could explain what was happening, but the explanation always led back to the same thing: the jinn. He had opened the door, invited something into his home, and now it was going to destroy him. The thoughts tumbled through his head like a wrecking ball, each one more terrifying than the last. He had thought the jinn would be a myth, a superstition, a story his grandmother had told him to keep him in line when he was younger. But now, standing in this apartment, with the whispers growing louder and the walls closing in, he knew that the stories were real. The jinn were real. He staggered back, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, trying to locate the source of the noise, the source of the darkness that seemed to be creeping closer. But it was impossible. The jinn wasn't something that could be seen. It was everywhere, and yet it was nowhere. Its presence was all around him, suffocating him. It was the silence between the whispers, the coldness in the air, the heaviness that seemed to weigh down on his chest. It was the feeling of being watched, the feeling of being trapped. The knocking continued, louder now, like a drumbeat, shaking the walls, rattling his bones. His eyes snapped to the walls, but they remained empty. The sound was coming from everywhere, from inside the apartment, from inside him. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, slowly but surely, as if the apartment was folding in on itself, trapping him inside. Desperation clawed at him, and his mind raced. He had to get out. He had to escape. But how? There was no way out. No door, no window, no escape. The jinn had him. It had claimed this place, this apartment, this life. He had let it in, and now there was no escaping the consequences. The air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to form into words disjointed, mocking words that made his blood run cold. They were taunting him, laughing at his attempts to fight back. "You can't get rid of us," they seemed to say. "You can't escape." The words twisted in his mind, sinking deeper into his consciousness, until he wasn't sure if he was hearing them aloud or inside his head. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body felt heavy, weighed down by the oppressive energy in the room. It was as if the very air was pushing him down, making it impossible to escape. He reached for the door again, his fingers trembling as he grasped the handle. He needed to get out, to escape this nightmare. But when he turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. It was as if the apartment had sealed itself, trapping him inside with the jinn. Terror surged through him. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Had he really opened that door, invited this thing into his life, only to be consumed by it? The knocking continued, louder, faster. It was everywhere now, inside the walls, inside his head. He could hear it in his ears, in his chest, in his soul. It was relentless, and there was no escape. The whispers had grown into a shrieking chorus, filling every part of the apartment, every corner of his mind. And in that moment, he knew. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the jinn was never going to leave. It had claimed him. It had taken root in this place, in his soul. There was no escape, no hope. He had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. The jinn had marked him, and it would follow him wherever he went, always watching, always waiting. The weight of that truth settled deep in his chest, suffocating him. And as the night dragged on, with the whispers growing louder, the shadows stretching further, he realized one thing with horrific clarity. His life, the one he had once known, was over. This was his reality now, and it would never be the same again.